I've studied economic power for decades. Trade wars, sanctions, collapses, retaliation. And I can tell you this with absolute certainty. What just happened was never supposed to happen. A country that was expected to fold to panic, to beg for mercy, did none of that. Instead, it struck back in a way no model predicted. No tariffs, no threats, no negotiations, just silence. And then a coordinated consumer revolt that wiped out entire American industries. This wasn't a protest. It wasn't a policy. It was millions of people making one quiet decision at the same time. And the damage landed exactly where political arrogance is most vulnerable. On donors, on legacy brands, on workers who were told politics would never touch them. This is not a story about alcohol. It's not even a story about trade. It's about what happens when power is misunderstood, when bullying replaces strategy, and when leaders forget that markets are made of people. If you want to understand how real economic power works today and why this should scare you, stay with me. And if this analysis helps you see what's really happening, subscribe. This is a story more people need to understand. Now let me explain how this crisis actually began. To understand what's unfolding, we need to strip away the noise and look at the structure beneath it. This was not a spontaneous backlash. It was not an emotional overreaction. And it was certainly not accidental. What you're witnessing is the collision between political arrogance and economic reality. One side believed power flows only from the top down, that markets obey commands, that allies tolerate humiliation if the threats are loud enough. The other side understood something far more fundamental, that modern economies are not controlled solely by governments. They are shaped every day by trust, habit, and consumer choice. This conflict wasn't triggered by tariffs or legislation. It was triggered by words, by insults, by a profound misreading of how people respond when their dignity is challenged. And that miscalculation set off a chain reaction no strategist had planned for, not in Washington, not in corporate boardrooms, not even inside the industries now collapsing. What looks like a trade dispute is actually something deeper, a test of how power really works in the 21st century. To see why this outcome was inevitable, we have to go back to the mindset that started it all. This story doesn't begin with a boycott. It begins with a pattern. For decades, the United States has lived inside a powerful assumption that size equals leverage. That being the largest economy means others will always blink first. And for a long time, that assumption seemed to work. After World War II, America built a global system where access to its market was the prize. Allies accepted unequal terms because stability mattered more than pride. Trade wasn't just commerce. It was diplomacy backed by credibility. But credibility is not permanent. It's rented, and it must be renewed with restraint and respect. Over time, that restraint eroded. Economic relationships were no longer treated as long-term partnerships, but as short-term leverage plays. Pressure replaced patience. Threats replaced trust. And when trade becomes a weapon, something crucial changes. The system stops behaving like a machine and starts behaving like a network. Networks don't respond well to force. They reroute, they adapt, they quietly withdraw. That's the historical mistake here. Assuming that yesterday's dominance guarantees tomorrow's obedience, it doesn't. And once that illusion breaks, the consequences move fast. Because the moment respect disappears, people start looking for exits. And that brings us to the first real rupture. The rupture came quietly, but its impact was anything but. There was no press conference, no emergency vote, no dramatic announcement from Ottawa. Instead, something far more dangerous happened. Canadians acted on their own. No orders from the government, no legal restrictions, no trade barriers. Just a collective decision. Stop buying American products. And this wasn't random anger. It was targeted, strategic, almost surgical. The boycott focused on industries deeply tied to Republican funding and political loyalty. Bourbon, wine, iconic brands that had spent years financing the very politics now hurting them. The result was immediate and devastating. Kentucky's bourbon industry, valued at roughly $9 billion, went into freefall. Jim Beam, a name woven into American identity, shut down its main distillery for an entire year. A facility running continuously since 1935. 1,500 union workers left in limbo. The explanations came quickly. Facility upgrades, a whiskey glut, changing youth habits. None of them survive scrutiny. When production is down tens of millions of gallons, shortages don't look like gluts. And generational drinking habits don't collapse overnight. The truth was simpler and far more uncomfortable. The market was gone, and once it disappears, it doesn't politely come back. If this still feels abstract, stay with me. The deeper mechanics are about to surface. Now we need to understand why this damage runs so deep. To understand why this crisis is so severe, you have to understand the hidden machinery of markets. Industries don't collapse when sales dip. They collapse when expectations break. The bourbon industry isn't built on monthly demand. It's built on time, years of aging, decades of planning, capital locked into barrels that are supposed to grow more valuable every single day. That model only works if one assumption holds, that there will always be buyers at the end. Canada wasn't just a customer. It was a stabilizer, a predictable, reliable market that absorbed enormous volumes year after year. When that disappeared, the entire system tilted. Barrels meant to be assets became liabilities. Inventory became dead weight. Future revenue vanished overnight. And here's the part most people miss. Markets don't simply pause and wait for politics to calm down. They adapt. Once Canadian bars were forced to look elsewhere, habits changed. Bartenders experimented. Consumers discovered alternatives. Preferences shifted. This is the quiet brutality of economic systems. They don't argue, they don't protest, they just move on. Brand loyalty, once broken, does not magically return. Trust, once lost, demands years to rebuild if it returns at all. This is no longer a temporary shock. It's structural damage. And that damage was about to reveal itself in an even darker way. Then the second shock hit. This time, it wasn't symbolic. It was financial, and it was irreversible. One of the quiet pillars of the bourbon economy collapsed, the barrel market. Bourbon barrels aren't just containers. They're collateral. They're long-term assets used to secure loans, manage debt, and plan futures. When Kentucky Owl Bourbon entered bankruptcy, the illusion finally shattered. The company tried to do what the industry had always done, use aging barrels to stabilize the balance sheet. The court said no. Expert testimony made the reality impossible to ignore. There was no market, no buyers willing to pay anything close to expected value. Selling would require steep, punishing discounts if buyers could even be found. Think about what that means. Whiskey that should be gaining value with time was effectively worth less the longer it sat. An entire economic model, decades old, was suddenly upside down. This wasn't a slowdown. It wasn't a cycle. It was a structural break. And once financial institutions lose confidence, they don't come back easily. Credit tightens, investment freezes, layoffs follow. At this point, the damage was no longer theoretical. It was locked in. And the people about to feel it most weren't executives or politicians. It was the workers. Now I want you to slow down for a moment, because this is where the cost becomes human. If you're one of the workers in Kentucky, this crisis isn't a theory. It isn't an abstract lesson in political economy. It's your shift disappearing, your overtime cut, your job suddenly labeled uncertain. You didn't threaten Canada. You didn't design trade policy. You didn't turn diplomacy into a spectacle. But you're the one waking up at night wondering how long your savings will last. You're the one explaining to your family why next year looks different, why healthcare suddenly feels fragile, why a job your parents and grandparents relied on no longer feels safe. This is how bad economic policy always works. The people who create it are insulated from the consequences. The people who suffer never had a seat at the table. And that's the deepest injustice here. Political ego is rewarded, loyalty is protected, but responsibility is nowhere to be found. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt caught in the crossfire of decisions you didn't make, share this. Talk about it. Because silence is how this keeps happening. And if you're still with me, we need to zoom out, because this didn't stop at Kentucky. Zooming out, the implications become impossible to ignore. This was never just a dispute between two neighbors. It was a signal to the world. For decades, the United States assumed its economic gravity was absolute. That access to its market was so essential, no country would ever risk defying it. What happened with Canada shattered that assumption. Not because Canada is larger, not because it holds more power, but because it demonstrated something far more destabilizing, that modern economic influence doesn't flow only through governments. It flows through people. Trading partners everywhere are watching this closely. They're asking a quiet but dangerous question. If Canada can absorb pressure from the United States, why can't we? This is how precedents form. Not through treaties, but through proof. The message is clear. Economic coercion has limits. And when it's used recklessly, it accelerates diversification, not submission. Markets reroute. Suppliers change. Alliances loosen, and once trust fractures, it doesn't repair itself with a press release. What began as a display of dominance has evolved into a demonstration of vulnerability. For the first time in a long time, the world is seeing that United States cannot unilaterally dictate outcomes without paying a price. And that realization sets the stage for what comes next. Because the future is no longer singular. It's branching. From here, the future splits into three possible paths. The first is the best case scenario. Political pressure finally forces a change in tone. Threats give way to restraint. Relationships are slowly repaired. But even here, the damage lingers. Consumer habits formed over months don't reverse overnight. Some market share returns. Much of it never does. The second path is the most likely. Nothing fundamentally changes. The rhetoric continues. The boycott holds. Industries adapt downward instead of recovering upward. Production shrinks. Jobs don't come back. A once dominant export sector becomes smaller, quieter, less relevant. Not a collapse, a slow erosion. And then there's the worst case scenario, escalation. More threats, more retaliation. Other countries learn the same lesson Canada did and begin insulating themselves from American pressure. In that world, this isn't about bourbon anymore. It's about credibility, about whether the United States is seen as a reliable partner or an unpredictable risk. Systems don't break all at once. They decay when enough participants decide the cost of staying is higher than the cost of leaving. That's the fork in the road. And the choice being made right now will define far more than one industry. It will define how much influence America still has in a world that's learning it has options. And that brings us to the final reckoning. Here is the final truth, and it's uncomfortable. This didn't have to happen. No one forced Donald Trump to threaten a close ally. No one demanded insults on Christmas Day. No one required turning international trade into a test of personal dominance. This crisis was self-inflicted, driven by ego, sustained by silence, paid for by workers who had no voice in the decision. Canada didn't win because it was stronger. It won because it understood something fundamental. Power in modern economies is not just written into laws or treaties. It lives in everyday choices. When millions of people decide, calmly and collectively, that they will no longer reward arrogance, markets listen. Industries feel it, workers suffer it, and leaders who never face consequences walk away untouched. That is the real failure here. Not just bad policy, but leadership without accountability. If there's one lesson to carry forward, it's this. Bullying doesn't build prosperity. Respect does. If this analysis helped you see how power really works, share it. Talk about it. because understanding is the first step toward change. And if you want to keep following how these systems evolve, stay with me. This story isn't over.